Bring her to me. Now. The words didn't echo. They landed, heavy and deliberate, slicing clean through the golden hum of a $20 million gala where crystal chandeliers glowed like suspended sunlight, and every whispered conversation carried the weight of money, influence, and carefully rehearsed power. Forks paused mid-air, champagne glasses hovered inches from polished lips, and slowly, almost reluctantly, attention shifted toward the back of the room where Naomi Carter stood, a black waitress in a pressed uniform, her tray steady, her posture composed, her presence unnoticed, until now. She had spent the entire evening moving like a shadow between tailored suits and designer gowns, refilling glasses no one thanked her for, hearing conversations no one thought she understood, watching men who built empires speak as if the world itself were something they owned, and she had learned long ago that invisibility could be both shield and cage. Across the room, Ethan Caldwell didn't move from his seat, didn't raise his voice again, didn't need to, because power like his didn't shout. It summoned, and people obeyed. 38 years old, founder of a billion-dollar tech empire, he wore confidence like a custom suit, sharp, precise, unbothered, the kind of man who never looked twice at staff and never questioned whether he was the most important person in any room he entered. A nearby executive leaned in, half smiling, murmuring something that earned a quiet chuckle, and then Ethan's eyes flicked toward Naomi for the first time, not with curiosity, not with respect, but with the detached calculation of someone assessing a tool. Does she even understand what we're discussing? He said, not to her, but through her, as if she were part of the furniture, and a ripple of soft laughter followed, subtle but sharp enough to sting. Naomi didn't react, not outwardly, not yet, but something shifted in the stillness around her, a pause that stretched just a fraction too long, as if the room itself were holding its breath. The manager hesitated before gesturing her forward, a silent instruction she couldn't refuse, and so Naomi walked, each step measured, controlled, the soft tap of her shoes against marble somehow louder than the music now fading into the background. She stopped at the edge of the table, tray balanced, eyes level, saying nothing, offering nothing, simply present in a way that made a few guests shift uncomfortably in their seats. Ethan leaned back slightly, studying her without speaking, as though expecting something, an apology, a stumble, a confirmation of whatever assumption he had already made. But Naomi remained still, her silence not empty but deliberate, and in that silence, something unfamiliar began to ripple through the room, something subtle yet undeniable, like the first crack in glass that no one notices until it spreads. And then, just as one of the foreign investors began speaking rapidly in German about a clause buried deep inside a multimillion-dollar agreement, Naomi's fingers tightened ever so slightly around the edge of the tray, her gaze shifting, her focus sharpening, because this was the moment no one in that room saw coming. The German words flowed quickly across the table, sharp and precise, numbers layered between legal phrases that most of the room pretended to follow, but only a few truly understood, and Ethan Caldwell nodded along with the confidence of a man who never admitted confusion, his fingers tapping lightly against the polished surface as if control could be maintained through rhythm alone, while the investor across from him leaned forward, pointing at a specific clause buried deep within the contract. A clause that sounded routine to everyone else, but carried a subtle shift in liability that would quietly redirect nearly $50 million over the next 18 months. And no one at the table interrupted because no one noticed, no one except Naomi. She stood still, tray balanced, eyes steady, but her mind was no longer in the room as it appeared. It was moving through language, structure, meaning, breaking down each sentence as it was spoken, because this was not unfamiliar territory to her. Not really. Not when she had spent years studying international business texts in a small apartment with a flickering kitchen light. Not when she had once sat in lecture halls where conversations like this were dissected line by line. Not when she had learned that power often hid itself inside words people assumed were too complicated to question. A quiet breath left her lips as the investor finished speaking, and Ethan gave a short nod, signaling agreement without fully verifying, and that was the moment something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of precision that changes outcomes before anyone realizes a decision has been made. Naomi lowered the tray slowly onto the edge of the table, the soft clink of glass against wood cutting gently through the conversation. And for the first time since she had stepped forward, she spoke, not to Ethan, but directly to the investor, her voice calm, controlled, unmistakably fluent as she responded in German, correcting the interpretation of the clause with exact clarity, outlining the discrepancy in tone and implication, and suggesting an alternative phrasing that aligned with the original intent of the agreement. The words did not rush, they did not hesitate, they landed with quiet authority, and the effect was immediate. The investor blinked, surprised, then leaned in closer, listening again, this time with full attention, while a subtle tension rippled outward through the table like a wave that had not yet reached the edges of the room. Ethan's tapping stopped, his posture shifting almost imperceptibly as he turned his head, really turned it this time, looking at Naomi not as background, but as something else entirely, something he had not accounted for. A silence followed, not empty but charged, the kind that forces people to reassess what they thought they understood, and in that silence, the balance of the room tilted just enough to be felt. A second voice joined in, another investor now asking a question, also in German, testing, probing, and Naomi answered again without pause, her tone steady, her precision unwavering, each response tightening the focus around her, drawing attention in a way she had never been invited to before. Around them, the gala continued in fragments, music still playing, glasses still clinking, but at this table, something far more significant was unfolding, something that had nothing to do with status or titles and everything to do with who truly understood what was at stake. And for the first time that night, Ethan Caldwell was no longer the only one holding the room. The shift was subtle but undeniable, like the air pressure changing before a storm that no one had predicted, and every person seated at that table felt it, even if they could not explain it. Because Naomi Carter was no longer invisible, not after the second correction, not after the third response delivered with the same calm precision that refused to bend under scrutiny. And the investors who moments ago had spoken over her were now speaking to her, directing questions with a level of attention that Ethan Caldwell had not yet reclaimed. His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger but in recalculation, because men like him did not lose control. They adjusted, they adapted, they reasserted, and yet there was a delay, a fraction of a second too long each time Naomi spoke, as if his mind was working to catch up with a reality he had not prepared for. Across the table, the German investor leaned back, nodding slowly, clearly impressed, and then did something that shifted the balance even further. He addressed Naomi directly in English this time, asking where she had studied. A simple question on the surface, but one that carried weight, because it acknowledged her as a participant, not an interruption. Naomi paused, not out of uncertainty, but out of choice, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the table where her tray had been, her posture unchanged, her voice steady when she answered. I studied economics and international systems. Nothing more. No elaboration, no attempt to impress, just the truth delivered without decoration, and the simplicity of it landed harder than any explanation could have. A few glances were exchanged among the guests, subtle but telling, as if a silent recalibration was happening across the room, the kind that moves faster than words, the kind that shifts perception before anyone admits it. Ethan finally spoke, his tone controlled, measured, but no longer dismissive. And you are working here? The question hung between them, not openly disrespectful, but layered with something that had not yet decided whether it was curiosity or disbelief. Naomi met his gaze fully now, not challenging, not submissive, simply present. Yes, she said, and nothing else, because she did not owe him a narrative that made him comfortable. Another pause followed, longer this time, stretching just enough to make the silence feel intentional. And it was in that silence that the weight of the moment settled across the table. Because this was no longer about a contract, no longer about a clause hidden in legal language. It was about something far more fragile, the illusion of hierarchy that had just been cracked in front of witnesses who would remember it. A quiet voice from the far end of the table spoke again, returning to the deal, but the tone had changed, more cautious now, more deliberate, as if every word needed to be reconsidered in the presence of someone who had already seen through what others had missed. Naomi did not step back, did not retreat into the background, but she did not take center stage either. She simply remained where she was, existing in that narrow space between roles, no longer just a waitress, not officially anything else, but undeniably essential in a way that no title could define. And Ethan Caldwell, for the first time that night, realized that control was not something he could summon with a gesture, not when the room had already begun to listen to someone he had almost dismissed. The conversation resumed, but it no longer belonged to Ethan alone, and that realization settled into the room with a quiet weight that no one could ignore, because every time a clause was mentioned, every time a number was repeated, there was now a pause, a brief glance toward Naomi as if her presence had become a checkpoint no one had agreed to, but everyone had accepted. Ethan straightened slightly, reclaiming his posture, his voice returning with practiced authority as he began to guide the discussion forward, outlining projections, timelines, expected returns measured in hundreds of millions. And for a moment it seemed as though the balance might tilt back in his favor, as though the room would remember who had built the empire they were all here to admire. But power built on assumption has cracks, and those cracks had already begun to show. Across from him, the German investor tapped the document again, slower this time, more deliberate, and asked a question that sounded simple, but carried a deeper implication, something about risk exposure under revised conditions, something that required more than confidence to answer. And Ethan responded quickly, too quickly, his words polished but slightly misaligned with the nuance of what had just been raised. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but not to Naomi. She felt it immediately, the small shift in logic, the gap between what was being said and what was actually written. And for a second she said nothing, her gaze moving across the table, measuring, deciding, because stepping in once could be dismissed as coincidence, but stepping in again would redefine the entire dynamic. The room held that fragile tension, the kind that exists when something is about to change but has not yet committed to it. And then Naomi spoke, her voice calm, steady, cutting cleanly through the polished rhythm of corporate language, clarifying the discrepancy not as a challenge but as a correction, precise and grounded, referencing the exact phrasing that had been overlooked and the implication it carried over a 5-year projection, the kind of detail that could not be brushed aside without consequence. This time, no one laughed, no one interrupted, and no one looked away. Ethan's expression did not collapse, but it shifted, the edges tightening as he processed what had just happened, not publicly. Undone, not yet, but undeniably interrupted in a way that he had not anticipated. One of the American investors leaned back, exhaling slowly, then nodded toward Naomi with a quiet acknowledgement that carried more respect than any formal introduction could have offered. And just like that, the room adjusted again, not dramatically, not loudly, but enough to redraw the invisible lines that had defined who mattered and who did not. The manager who had sent Naomi forward now stood at a distance, uncertain, unsure whether to call her back or let the moment unfold, because what was happening no longer fit within the boundaries of service. It had crossed into something else entirely, something that could not be undone without consequence. Naomi remained composed, not stepping further in, not stepping back, existing in that exact point where presence becomes power without needing permission, and in that stillness, the illusion that had carried the evening began to fade, because control, once questioned, never returns in quite the same way. By now the room had stopped pretending, the soft hum of distant conversations fading into something irrelevant compared to the quiet intensity gathering at that table, because what had started as a controlled negotiation was turning into something far less predictable, something that no amount of preparation could fully contain. Ethan Caldwell leaned forward slightly, fingers interlocked, reclaiming space not with volume but with presence, the kind that had built his empire, the kind that had ended conversations before they began. And when he spoke again, his voice carried that familiar weight, steady, deliberate, redirecting the discussion back toward projected gains, market expansion, long-term positioning measured in billions rather than millions, as if scale alone could restore the hierarchy that had begun to slip. For a moment, it worked, heads nodded, pens moved, the rhythm returned. But beneath it all there was hesitation now, a thin layer of doubt that had not been there before, because once a room witnesses a flaw, it listens differently. Across the table, one of the investors flipped a page, slower than before, scanning more carefully, and then asked a follow-up question about compliance thresholds tied to the same clause Naomi had already corrected, except this time the question went deeper, into a secondary implication that had not yet been addressed. Ethan paused, just briefly, barely noticeable to anyone not watching closely, but Naomi saw it. The fraction of a second where certainty had to be reconstructed rather than recalled. And in that space, she understood something important. This was no longer about a single correction. It was about a pattern that had not been challenged until now. She could feel the weight of choice settle in again. Step back and let the moment fade, or step forward and change what happened next. And the difference between those two paths was not small. It was the difference between remaining invisible and becoming undeniable. Her voice entered the conversation once more, not louder, not sharper, but clearer, cutting through the layered language with a level of precision that did not ask for permission, outlining how the compliance threshold, when paired with the revised clause, would create an exposure window that could not be mitigated by the current structure, her explanation moving step by step, grounded in logic, impossible to dismiss without addressing directly. This time, the reaction was immediate. No delay, no polite nods masking confusion, just stillness, the kind that signals understanding has arrived all at once. One investor leaned forward, another exchanged a glance, and the German partner who had first spoken earlier gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, the kind that comes from recognizing competence where it was not expected. Ethan's gaze remained fixed on Naomi, not dismissive now, not even skeptical, but measuring, recalculating in real time, because whatever assumption he had made at the beginning of the night no longer held. And in that moment, something irreversible took place, not dramatic, not announced, but final in its own quiet way. The room no longer belonged to titles, it belonged to clarity, and the person who had brought that clarity into focus was no longer standing at the edge of the table. She was at its center without ever taking a seat. The energy at the table no longer belonged to momentum. It belonged to scrutiny, and that distinction changed everything, because deals like this were not lost in loud moments. They were lost in quiet realizations, the kind that settled slowly into the minds of people who had spent their entire careers learning how to detect risk before it became visible. Ethan Caldwell exhaled through his nose, controlled, steady, his posture still composed but no longer effortless. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a sharper edge, not directed at Naomi, not openly, but present in the way he reasserted his position, walking through the structure of the deal with more detail than before, reinforcing projections, reaffirming safeguards, layering confidence over the growing doubt that had begun to circulate. For a brief moment, it seemed like control might stabilize, like the room might return to its original alignment. But something had already shifted too far to be undone so easily, because once people begin to question, they do not stop at one question. A senior investor near the end of the table leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, and asked for clarification on the revenue protection model tied to the same clause Naomi had addressed, except this time his tone was different, less agreeable, more analytical, as if he were no longer participating in a presentation but conducting an evaluation. Ethan answered, precise, confident, but Naomi could hear it, the slight overcompensation, the way his explanation stretched just enough to cover a gap that should not have been there. And she understood then that the flaw was not isolated. It was embedded, woven into assumptions that had gone unchallenged because no one in the room had been looking closely enough. Her gaze moved across the contract again, not physically, but mentally, reconstructing the structure, tracing the implications across timelines, revenue streams, compliance layers. And what she found was not a single issue. It was a cascade, subtle but real, a chain of conditions that, if triggered, would shift control away from Ethan's company in ways that could not be easily reversed. She felt the weight of that realization settle in her chest, heavier than anything that had come before, because this was no longer about correcting language. This was about exposing a vulnerability that could redefine the entire deal. The room continued to speak around her, voices overlapping, questions forming, but Naomi stepped into the space between them once more, not interrupting, not forcing attention, simply entering it with a clarity that cut through everything else, her voice steady as she outlined the secondary risk, connecting the clause to downstream outcomes, explaining how a single overlooked condition could trigger a shift in control thresholds within 36 months. Her words precise, grounded, impossible to dismiss without direct engagement. This time, the reaction was not silence alone. It was recognition, visible, immediate, the kind that spreads across a table in glances, in posture, in the subtle way people stop writing and start listening fully. Ethan did not respond right away, and that pause, longer than any before it, said more than words could have, because in that moment, the man who had commanded the room realized that the conversation was no longer moving around him. It was moving through someone he had almost ignored. The silence that followed did not feel empty anymore. It felt decisive, like something had just crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. And for the first time that evening, the power in the room did not come from titles or wealth, but from clarity that no one could ignore. Ethan Caldwell finally leaned back, not in dominance, but in recalibration, his fingers no longer tapping, his expression no longer performing confidence, but processing reality. And when he spoke again, his tone had changed. Still controlled, but stripped of the casual authority that had defined him earlier. "Walk me through that again," he said, this time directly to Naomi, not around her, not past her, but to her, and that single shift carried more weight than any apology could have. Naomi did not rush, did not hesitate. She simply began, breaking down the structure step by step, explaining how the clause interacted with compliance thresholds, how the timeline created a vulnerability window, how control could shift gradually rather than suddenly, her voice steady, measured, grounded in logic rather than emotion. And as she spoke, the room followed, not because they were told to, but because they needed to. One investor leaned forward, another began marking notes more carefully, and the German partner who had first tested her now nodded openly, no longer subtle, acknowledging what everyone had already realized. Ethan listened, truly listened, his gaze fixed, his posture still, absorbing each point, without interruption, and in that stillness there was something unfamiliar, not weakness, not defeat, but recognition, the kind that comes when someone encounters a perspective they did not anticipate but cannot deny. When Naomi finished, the room remained quiet for a moment longer, not out of confusion but out of agreement forming in real time. And then the questions came, not directed at Ethan, but at her, layered, specific, respectful, each one building on what she had just revealed. And Naomi answered them with the same calm precision, not expanding beyond what was necessary, not claiming more than what was true, simply providing clarity where it was needed. Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders settling as he glanced down at the contract, then back up at Naomi. And in that brief exchange something shifted that no one announced, but everyone felt, because the man who had once summoned her like an afterthought was now measuring his next move in relation to her understanding. "We need to revise this," he said finally, not as a suggestion, but as a conclusion, and this time there was no resistance, no hesitation, only quiet agreement moving across the table. The deal had not collapsed, but it had changed, fundamentally, because control had moved from assumption to verification, from authority to accuracy. And at the center of that shift stood someone who had never been invited into the conversation in the first place. Naomi did not react to the acknowledgement, did not smile, did not step forward. She simply remained where she was, composed, grounded, as if none of this required validation, because the truth did not need recognition to be true. And yet in that moment, recognition had finally arrived. The agreement did not resume the way it had begun. It could not. Because once clarity replaces assumption, every word carries more weight, every number demands proof, and every decision becomes slower, sharper, more deliberate. The investors were no longer leaning back in passive confidence. They were engaged now, scanning documents line by line, asking questions that dug beneath surface projections, and each time they did, their eyes shifted not only to Ethan Caldwell, but to Naomi Carter, as if the balance of trust had quietly expanded to include her presence. Ethan adjusted his cuff slightly, a small gesture, controlled, but it revealed something that had not been visible before, not uncertainty exactly, but awareness, the understanding that the room had changed in a way he could not fully command. "Back. We will revise the clause and redistribute the exposure," he said, his voice steady, reclaiming structure, but no longer dismissing the variables that had been uncovered. And this time, when he spoke, it was not to dominate the conversation, it was to align with it. Naomi listened, her posture unchanged, her expression neutral, but her attention remained precise, tracking each adjustment, each new condition being proposed. And when a revised version was suggested, she spoke again, not to challenge, but to refine, ensuring that the correction did not create a new imbalance elsewhere. Her words measured, her tone consistent, reinforcing that clarity was not a moment, it was a process. The German investor nodded more openly now, even offering a brief smile of acknowledgement, while another partner requested that Naomi review the updated phrasing before moving forward, a request that would have been unthinkable less than an hour ago. And yet no one questioned it now. Across the table, Ethan watched this unfold, not with resistance, but with a growing recognition that something fundamental had shifted, not just in the deal, but in the dynamic itself, because authority had not disappeared, it had evolved, and it now required something more than presence to sustain it. The music in the background continued, soft and distant, the gala still alive around them, but at this table, the atmosphere had narrowed into something far more focused, where status no longer guaranteed. Certainty and precision carried more influence than reputation. Naomi placed her hand lightly against the edge of the document, her gaze moving once more across the revised terms, confirming alignment, closing gaps, ensuring that what had nearly been overlooked would not be missed again. And when she finally nodded, it was not dramatic, not emphasized, just a quiet confirmation that the structure now held. Ethan gave a small nod in return, almost imperceptible, but real, an acknowledgement not of hierarchy, but of accuracy, and that distinction lingered in the air longer than any applause could have. The deal moved forward, but not as it had been designed. It moved forward stronger, clearer, built not on unchecked authority, but on verified understanding. And at the center of that transformation stood someone who had entered the room without a voice and reshaped it without raising one. The signatures came quietly, one after another, ink meeting paper in a sequence that carried more weight than the entire evening that led up to it, because this was no longer just a transaction measured in millions or projected over years. It was a decision shaped by a moment that no one had planned for and no one in the room would forget. The tension that had once filled the table dissolved into something steadier, not celebration, not relief, but respect, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that lingers in how people look at one another differently afterward. Ethan Caldwell closed the folder with a measured motion, his expression composed, but no longer untouched, and for a brief second he remained still, as if acknowledging something internally before standing, the subtle shift of posture drawing attention without demanding it. Around him, conversations began to return in fragments, the gala slowly reclaiming its rhythm, but the center of gravity had already moved, and those who had witnessed it carried that awareness with them even as they stepped away. Naomi Carter lifted her tray again, the same one she had set down minutes earlier, her movements calm, precise, unchanged on the surface, as if nothing significant had happened at all, and yet everything had. She turned slightly, preparing to step back into the flow of the room, back into the quiet anonymity that had once defined her place in it, when Ethan spoke, not loudly, not publicly, but enough for her to hear. "Naomi," he said, using her name for the first time, not as a command, but as recognition. She paused, just briefly, her shoulders still, her gaze steady as she looked toward him, and in that moment there was no imbalance, no hierarchy pressing down on the space between them, only clarity. He did not rush his next words, did not reach for something polished or rehearsed. "You saw what no one else did," he said, simple, direct, without embellishment, and for a man who had built his reputation on certainty, that admission carried more weight than any formal praise. Naomi held his gaze for a second longer, then gave a small nod, not accepting, not rejecting, simply acknowledging, because what she had done did not require validation to exist. A few nearby guests watched quietly, sensing that something more meaningful than the deal itself had just taken place, something that would not be recorded in contracts or headlines, but would shape how each of them moved forward from this night. Naomi turned again, stepping back into the current of the gala, her presence dissolving into the movement of servers and guests. But the absence she left behind at the table was noticeable, like a space that had been filled with something essential and could not be replaced by anything else. Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, his gaze following her path before returning to the room. And for the first time that evening, the man who had once believed he owned every space he entered understood something far more valuable. That power can command attention, but it cannot replace truth. And once truth speaks, even quietly, it has a way of rewriting everything.